and the slides. We hope you'll join us for our additional webinars or watch our recordings anytime, so please visit aspcapro.org for more information. I also want to point out that due to so much interest in the topic of ringworm, we've added a Q&A session, Let's Talk Fungus. So registration is open on the ASPCA Pro site. We hope to see a lot of you there. So for those who are back for more about ringworm, Dr. Sandra Newberry is our presenter. She's a graduate of the University of Wisconsin School of Veterinary Medicine and has a special interest in infectious disease and population management as it relates to group health. In 2006, Dr. Newberry joined the Correct Shelter Medicine program at UC Davis. She also serves as the chair of the Shelter Standards Task Force of the Association of Shelter Veterinarians and an adjunct assistant professor of shelter medicine in the Department of Pathobiology at the University of Wisconsin School of Veterinary Medicine. She's published several articles and book chapters relevant to shelter medicine with a focus on infectious disease, immunology, and population medicine to improve understanding of shelter animal health, disease response, and animal welfare. So with all of that, a big welcome back to so many of you, and Dr. Newberry, the floor is yours.
Well, hi, everybody, and welcome. It's great to have you all here. And I think many of you, I'm just sort of looking at who's here, so I think many of you have probably heard the Ringworm 101 talk that we did last time, so our kind of basic information about ringworm. And this time what we're going to do is we're going to move on and talk very specifically about managing outbreaks as well, and sort of go through a couple of little case studies to get us started with that. And so, sorry, just a minute. Okay. I wanted to start out as we're talking about managing an outbreak of ringworm that to really kind of give you just a word of caution. And this is really true anytime we're talking about managing infectious disease in animal shelters, or really anytime we're managing medical things in shelters, is that we want to be careful and understand that when you're getting all this information, that we want you to have all this information, and really what it's meant for is to help you work with a veterinarian, that veterinarians are the ones who should be diagnosing and treating disease. This is especially true when we're talking about treating infectious diseases with the potential to infect humans. So, and especially when we're talking about outbreaks. We've seen lots of shelters who have tried to respond to outbreaks all on their own without having a veterinarian involved, and in general, it doesn't go nearly as well as getting a veterinarian involved. So I'm hoping that the information we're given to you here will be used in that way. So we wanted to just kind of start out talking about that. And I know many of you are veterinarians, and that's really exciting to us too, to have so many veterinarians and such a wide range of experience on these calls, on these webinars. So I wanted to start out by just talking about outbreak response in general. When we think about how we're going to respond to an outbreak, these are kind of the standard sort of things that we think about. First, we want to try to identify and diagnose the primary agent if we can. Sometimes that's just not possible. Sometimes you have to go with an understanding of, well, what's the syndrome? So we might think, well, it's a respiratory disease outbreak, and we may be able to get to the bottom of, what the primary agent is, and sometimes we might not. We also really want to do an assessment very early on what is that organization's capacity to respond. Do they have 2 staff members and, 400 cats? Hopefully not. Do they have the ability, do they have a veterinarian who can work with them? Do they not? I know there are definitely shelters that I've worked with that when I say, you need to get a veterinarian to work with you on this outbreak, and they say we can't find one anywhere who will work with us to help us. And that sometimes does happen, and then you want to kind of figure out, well, why is that happening and what could be done differently? want to look and assess the impact of any possible response plans, and I'm going to talk with you specifically about that, but we really want to understand, well, what's going to happen if we respond along pathway A versus pathway B? What's the impact going to be on our life-saving capacity? What's going to be the cost to animal life? What are the risks involved for humans? What are the resources that we'll need to invest? And we need to think about life-saving for animals who are currently in the shelter, as well as animals that may need to come into the shelter. So these are just kind of the things that we think about when we're talking about outbreaks, and you know, how we start to put these things together. So I'm going to go through all of these at the beginning, and then you'll see how we're going to fit ringworm kind of into this framework. So when we go to actually respond to the outbreak, the first thing we want to think about is doing an evaluation of history. So what history and clinical signs are we seeing kind of on the organizational level? And what you'll hear me talking about today, especially in the couple cases I'm going to tell you about, is usually for me or some other veterinarian who's consulting with the shelter, that usually starts with either an email or a phone call where somebody's saying, oh, well, here's what we think is going on. And you want to try to sort of say, well, you know, what are you seeing and how long has it been going on, and those kinds of things. We'll get into that much more specifically. I'm going to come back and talk very specifically about the concept of a clean break, and that's a really key point that we're going to talk about several times. So I want to introduce it to you now and have you think about it kind of throughout the next hour. But the idea really is that you're going to be separating the population of animals that have been exposed from any new animals. And basically this is a way of stopping the cycle of infection and stopping the cycle of an outbreak. And this, again, is true of any kind of outbreak you might have. So the clean break is one of our kind of key things that we like to have shelters learn about. Evaluating clinical signs at the individual animal level is kind of the next thing we do, where we start to say, well, who's sick and who isn't sick, who's affected by the outbreak and who isn't affected by the outbreak. And then the next thing is to say, well, of those who aren't already affected, who's likely to get sick and who's not. And then the next step is to separate out the sick animals or the affected animals, and then hopefully when treatment is an option, to treat them. And so we're going to talk about all those things. The next thing I want to kind of just cover, and for many of you who were at the first webinar that we did, you already kind of know what the rules are for ringworm, and the sort of fancy way of calling ringworm is dermatophytosis. And the rules are kind of the basic things that we need to keep in mind when we're managing an outbreak of this disease. And so the things we need to think about are that it has what we call a pleomorphic presentation. So pleomorphic means it can look like lots of different things. It can be tricky to be sure what it is. There's many species of dermatophytes, and you'll hear that over and over. But again, what I'm going to tell you is that M. canis is by far the most commonly implicated in clinical problems. I did hear from a shelter down in Austin, Texas, that they see a lot of M. gypsum. And so, you know, I'd love to hear, and if you guys want to put it in the chat, if you're seeing lots of things that aren't M. canis, I'm curious about that. One of the things we've really always wanted to do and have tried gearing up for it a few times, but we still haven't got it, is to really kind of get a survey of shelters from all over the country to kind of see, well, what kind of ringworm are they experiencing, and what's a common incidence and all of that. We've never been able to do that. So when I'm telling you things like M. canis is most commonly implicated, we work with shelters really at this point all over the world, and what we see most commonly is M. canis by far. So it's interesting that there are still other species out there, so please don't think that there aren't. But M. canis is the one to be the most concerned about. Lesions may not be obvious, and that's something that can sometimes be, again, be kind of tricky. So we need to be very careful that we're doing the screening that we need to do. And I hope you'll, if you didn't see the last webinar, look back at that screening section because we won't go through that too much today, though we will go through it kind of a speed version. Woods lamp exam, this is the good news. Woods lamp exams highlight fluorescence from M. canis. So because M. canis is the most common, if we use a Woods lamp, we're going to be able to pick up most things. And then we want to remember, again, when we're talking about the rules, that fungal culture is still the gold standard in terms of diagnosis. DTM, or dermatophyte test media, is a standard growth media, so we're going to talk a lot about that. And a red color change with white-ish, so we can sometimes get down to kind of a tan color. Fluffy growth indicates the need for a microscopic exam. And that is, as I say almost every time I give these presentations, if there's only one thing you remember from this presentation, please remember that a red color change indicates a need for a microscopic exam, not a positive. And you'll see, kind of drill that into you today, I hope. That we really need to have a positive microscopic identification for diagnosis. We can do direct exam of Woods positive hairs, and that, I say, is like a snap test, or just a really quick way of finding positives for dermatophytosis. The one thing that's still really problematic when we think about kind of the rules for ringworm is that the only way really to rule out ringworm is to do a fungal culture. The thing is that we don't need to rule it out in everyone, and so what's most important is ruling it in. Okay, so what I'm going to start with is the first case, and I'm going to go through just a couple of quick little studies. So the first email that I got in this case was from a veterinarian. She says, I'm in the tail end, I hope and pray, of a ringworm outbreak in the shelter. I have some specific questions. I greatly appreciate any input you can offer. We have old-style plastic-covered wood cages. They're not up to standard, but the funds are limited. I recommended to management to purchase stainless steel cages, but it's at $10,000. It takes some convincing. She goes on to talk about, that she really wants to get some new cages, but she wants some suggestions on cleaning. Is there any hope, any input, or even information as to why we should buy new cages would be really helpful. Then she's talking about other things about cleaning, and she says, thank you, I appreciate all your help and advice. I was out of town when that first email came, and then I was back in town just a couple of days later, and I got the second email. And the second email says, hi, doctor, once again. I just wanted to email you again so that maybe I could be top of the list with my concerns since you've been away from the clinic. I have an update on my ringworm struggles. Unfortunately, we've had a few cultures come back positive. I've randomly chose one cat per room. I am sending out those cultures to be ID'd by a lab, which will take at least 7 days, if not longer. Unfortunately, the CEO, director, etc., are now leaning towards depopulation. Decision will be finalized this afternoon. I am mortified but understand, so please see if you can answer my questions. So now, hope you were paying attention. What's wrong with this picture so far? And I'm going to be looking at the chat for your answers. Did anybody pick up anything that was wrong? Concentrate on that second email.
But that doesn't mean that one.
Okay, so somebody's saying ringworm has not been confirmed. Somebody else is saying making depopulation decisions before the cultures are back. Assuming ringworm without a culture. So she's saying she had some animals coming back positive, which kind of sounds like they did do fungal cultures, right? But then she's saying it needs to be confirmed by sent out to a lab. So great, Emma is saying positive how? By a color change. And so again, when we hear this in an email, this is when I start getting really nervous because unfortunately we've had a few cultures come back positive. I'm sending out those cultures to be ID'd by a lab, which will take at least 7 days, if not longer. So when I see somebody calling something positive before it's been identified, that starts making me really nervous. And this was, in fact, a case where the cultures were being called positive because of a red color change. So I warned you, I'm going to drill this into your head. So when we see this red color change, we need to take a tape prep. We need to look at a microscope. If you're lucky, I found this on the internet, you can have your own Hello Kitty microscope. And then we need to actually identify the species, and this in particular here is Microsporum canis. And that's what we need in order to call something positive. So good A+ for all of those of you who answered that question. The other thing, and again, A+ to all of you, is when considering depopulation, that's a very, very serious consideration to make, and this is from the Association of Shelter Veterinarians position statement on depopulation. When considering depopulation, many factors, including transmission, morbidity, mortality, and public health, should be taken into account. Along with shelter administration, board members, staff, community veterinarians, it is recommended that shelter medicine experts or related professionals be contacted for opinions and advice before making a final decision. All other avenues should be fully examined and depopulation viewed as a last resort. So I see there's one question about what's the difference between morbidity and mortality. Morbidity means how many are getting sick, and mortality means how many are dying. And so what we're saying here in this statement is that we want to really understand that depopulation is really only the route of last resort, and in most cases there's another approach to be taken. And so I wanted to just, since we're talking about outbreaks in particular, I want to be sure that we're having that discussion. So here is what the result of that decision was. They publicized that there was going to be depopulation of the animals in the shelter, and as you can see, it created an enormous ruckus. They had protesters outside their shelter, and they had ultimately there was no depopulation, though it was very, very difficult for them to explain that later. They stopped their plans for depopulation, and we did a great deal of investigation to see if they had a ringworm outbreak or not, and ultimately they had external experts evaluate the entire situation because there was so much outcry from the public about what happened. So when we did further evaluations, in-house cultures had growth, but the microscopic identification revealed various contaminants. There was no positive ID from any diagnostic lab. All the animals that had been reported to be Woods positive had only faintly glowing yellow sebum on the skin. So remember, I showed you, and I'm going to show you some pictures again, we're looking for that apple green glow. Sometimes we'll see a very hot sort of blue-white glow, but when we see a very faint yellow glow just on the skin, that's not ringworm. We're looking for that hair, that fluorescence that coats the hair as the fungus is growing. All the cultures and reports of positives from private practice were based on red color change alone and were identified by the diagnostic labs as contaminants. So this was, I want to be clear, it wasn't just one veterinarian who was making the same mistake. It was a pretty universal thing, and when I looked into it more and more, I found that the company that was making the culture plates was actually saying that that these cultures were capable of identifying the pathogen without a microscopic exam, which is just not the case. So reported human cases had no diagnostic testing but were based on history of exposure to the outbreak. And that, again, what I've discovered is that that's reasonably common in human medicine, that rather than running fungal cultures, they'll presume based on exposure to what was understood to be ringworm that a person has ringworm and elect to treat. No evidence of fungal infection was found in any species, and so this was a giant tempest in a teapot, really, though it wasn't really just in a teapot. It kind of exploded the whole teapot based on a pretty sound misunderstanding of how we actually diagnose this infectious disease. So I want to be very, very careful to make sure. I hope I've achieved it now to drill into. This is the only positive we found in all the cultures that we did, and I think I have, and so you can see here there was one colony that grew from one cat who was not lesional. And you can see this is this is only just a small sampling of the culturing that we did. So I see Kim has a question in the chat that says, is the whitish growth enough to diagnose ringworm? And what do we think? Is there anybody who thinks that the whitish growth is enough to diagnose ringworm? Now that we just talked about that, I want you guys to answer that one in the chat. Thanks. So everybody is saying no. That is the big problem. So what we really need to see is we need to see yellow turning to red on the DTM. We need to see whitish growth, and that is to us like a siren going off saying you need to get the microscope. And so please, please, that's very, very important. I'm using that one shelter as a case study. I could pick from a giant smattering of shelters where I've seen exactly the same thing, and it breaks my heart. And so that is why I'm trying to drill it into all of you. So thanks. So the results of this particular really non-outbreak was that it was very, very damaging to this organization's reputation. It increased the amount of scrutiny on that organization. But the silver lining in all of that is that it did increase their internal evaluation really dramatically, and absolutely dramatically has improved their operations. And this is not something that would ever happen again at that shelter at this point. They're very, very careful and very thorough in the way they're approaching things. So we're going to move on to case 2, and case 2 is a very different shelter, very different circumstance. And in this case, the email that I first got was talking about what they thought to be a very widespread outbreak, and it was something that they thought had been going on for a very, very long time. They had quite a number of cats in the shelter, and this is kind of the layout of the shelter, and they had an upstairs and a downstairs. And after I had a brief phone call with them, and they started in working on trying to take the steps that we were recommending to them, I got an email back from them saying, today we spent 6 hours at the shelter culturing, briefly examining, medicating, and dipping 65 cats in 5 rooms upstairs. And then at the end of the email, she says, as a reminder, 5 of the cats on this sheet were adopted out before the results came in. Okay, my head hurts now. And the reason that I wanted to include that is just to let you know that, when we work through outbreaks, it's easier when we do it in a systematic way, and we can definitely beat ringworm. The answer is yes, you can, but it really does take an enormous amount of work. And I wanted you to see, so in contrast to the outbreak and the diagnostic results from the case I showed you before, here's the diagnostic results from this case. And what you can see when we report our results, red means a positive, and what you can see in this case is almost all of the positives are P2s or P3, so there's more than 9 colonies growing on those plates. And when we look in the lesion column, which is right here, I'm trying to pick up my pointer, right there, you can see that all of these cats had lesions. And what we had here is only one kitty who was not positive, and I can show you kind of just a smattering of other results from that same shelter. So this was a shelter, this is what a ringworm outbreak looks like, and this was perhaps the most significant ringworm outbreak I've ever seen, where there was really a rare negative cat in this organization. So this was a huge battle for them. So let's say we have this situation going on. So where do we start? Now we're going to start and kind of walk through all these different steps. And Louise, I'm going to come back to the timing for culture, so if you can hold on to your question for just a sec. So when we start, we get this initial context. Somebody thinks there's an outbreak of ringworm. Well, who is it? Why do they think there's an outbreak of ringworm, and which animals are involved? So that's the very first thing that we want to talk about, and this is where, for any of you who've ever contacted me, when you think you're having a problem with ringworm, you'll hear that usually the first question I ask is, well, what species, and how did you diagnose it? Because I want to make sure that it's not just the red media. And I want to know, has the veterinarian looked at the cats? And I want to know, well, is it just cats? Is it cats and dogs? Are there humans involved? What's going on? And so this is the step that I told you about earlier, where this is really our go step. When Karen Moriello and I were talking about putting together these pieces of, well, how do you respond to a ringworm outbreak, she had this idea, and I think it's a really nice one, to think about, well, what day do you do this on? So this is kind of day one, where we have this initial contact. The step one of this initial evaluation is to kind of figure out, well, what's already been done? Is there already, do we know disease is present? That's really important. So are we seeing lesions in animals? Does it seem like we've got lesions in more than one animal? Is it an outbreak? And that's really the next question is, so, is there ringworm at all in the first place? Or do we know that? Do we need to look into that more? Or do we just think that that's what's happening? We want to understand what the severity is. So does it look like all the cats are affected or just a few? Do we see other clinical signs along with it? What species, what ages, how many? This is a really important time to think and ask questions about husbandry practices. And when I'm saying asking questions, it may be that you're asking those questions of yourself. So it may not be that you're helping another organization. Maybe you're helping your own organization. You really want to think, well, does the way that we clean and the way the animals are housed, does that put us more at risk with this outbreak, or does it put us less at risk? And then we want to think about what kind of disease was reported sort of at the source. Did the animals come from somewhere where we know there was a big problem with ringworm in the first place? This is a time that we really want to think both about illness that we're seeing in individual animals, and then also try to kind of understand the group signs, so what we're seeing in the whole group of animals. Again, here we go. We want to talk about what testing has already been done and really look into it. Sometimes I'll have people, take pictures of what they saw through the microscope or other things like that, so we can really make sure that the thing that you thought was ringworm is really ringworm. We'd love to have a veterinarian come in and screen for lesions, or at least get staff who are really well trained to understand what an inflammatory lesion looks like. People who are trained to use a wood lamp. This is one of the reasons, from a preventative standpoint, we want to get you guys all trained doing this every day, because then if you ever need it, you've already got these skills. These are the same skills as the skills that we hope you have for having animals come into your shelters. The same screenings that you use for intake are the same screenings that you're going to use if you think you might have an outbreak. So you're going to look at animals and understand whether, are they woods lamp positive? Did anybody look at the hair directly under a microscope? Were fungal cultures done, and was it identified microscopically? So now we're going to think a little bit about kind of what are the key concepts, what we want to do when we're starting to respond to the outbreak response, is that we really want to stop the cycle of transmission. That's the first thing. So once we say, yeah, we think this is an outbreak, or even we think it might be an outbreak, but we're not sure, the first thing we need to do is give ourselves a little breathing room. And I remember one of the first kind of pieces of advice I ever heard somebody give in a shelter way back when I started working in shelters is, if you have a cat who's peeing in the house, the first thing you should advise the person to do is get a waterproof cover for their mattress. And I thought, wow, that's great, because the thing is, you want to make sure you put the preventative things in place to make sure it's not going to get any worse than it already is. And so this thinking about stopping this cycle, what we want to make sure is things are in an outbreak, things can grow exponentially. So once you have 2 cats infected, it's more likely that you'll go to having 4 cats infected and then 8 rather than 1, 2, 3. So we want to get in the way and stop that cycle. The problem with ringworm is there is this potentially long diagnostic period. Now, somebody asked a question just a minute ago, I think it was Louise, about having to wait 2 weeks for the culture to come back. If you incubate your cultures, if you run your cultures in-house and you incubate them a little bit warmer than room temperature, as we talked about in the last webinar, usually the time it takes for the cultures to come back to be finalized is usually anywhere from 10 days to 2 weeks, but usually you'll be able to see that they're suspect by about 5 days. So you start getting information back throughout this period that you're working with the cultures. The other problem is that there's an ease of transmission with ringworm, and sometimes I think that that can be actually overstated. There is great ease of transmission for animals that haven't been recognized to have ringworm, but once an animal's been recognized and control measures are put in place, what we've been able to show is that it's very controllable to not have that spread go on. So we know that with good topical treatment and good disinfection and handling practices, this ease of transmission starts to shrink. Clinical signs can overlap with other skin conditions, and so that's why it's on the problem list, because now we have to wait for a culture. If we don't get a positive, it's much easier to rule ringworm in when it's present than it is to rule it out. And so sometimes, because we need to be careful, we end up having that sort of in-between period where we're not quite sure what's going on. The other thing that's a real reality is that the spores can go into the environment, and that's, again, something that happens more when we don't know that ringworm is present. Then once we do know it's present, we can control that. But if something snuck up on us, then often we have a real problem in the environment we need to take care of as well. Now, it is highly contagious, but like I just said, the undiagnosed animal is the one that's the highest risk, and we've been able to show pretty carefully, and we'll talk about this actually at the webinar at the end of the month, is that in a treatment facility, if you're treating with a topical solution and you're using good treatment protocols, we very rarely see, if ever, environmental contamination in the treatment areas. It's really the places where we don't know that a cat has ringworm, where, as I talked about before, they're kind of like pig pen and they're shedding their dusty spores everywhere you go. And so it's really the undiagnosed cases, which again takes us back to really the importance of screening and intake, because if you're screening and intake, they won't sneak in on you and spread their spores. We call it sporulating. They won't be sporulating all over the place if you're picking them up at intake.
Yes. Susan, I'm wondering if I can toss in a quick question speaking
Sure.
of sporulating. Emma has a question. If your staff or volunteers end up with lesions, should they be allowed to continue working? Should the area be covered? And is a Band-Aid enough to do the job?
So in humans, they usually treat topically. Sometimes they treat topically and orally. It depends on the extent of in the human. If it's just a localized lesion, then usually, because humans bathe so frequently and we don't have nearly as much hair, what you see over here on our two-headed kitten, that usually if it's a small localized lesion, the lesion can be covered, and usually there's a topical treatment, so the topical treatment is probably dramatically knocking down the number of spores. On the other hand, if it's a very significant and severe infection, then there is a potential risk that they'll be shedding, but again, humans are much better at controlling and covering their lesions. One case I know of, a friend of mine as a veterinary student had ringworm covering about half of her face, and was using a topical treatment, but ultimately the decision was made that it didn't make any sense for anybody for her to try to treat animals, because there was just no good way for her to cover that and feel really comfortable. Again, just to be clear, I'm not a human doctor, but that's kind of to the best of my understanding.
Fantastic. Thanks.
Okie doke. So the other thing we need to think about when we're thinking about ringworm is that it does have about a 2 to 3 week incubation period. So from the time of exposure, or actually really infection, so from the time that the fungus can gain access to the skin, it may take 2 to 3 weeks for lesions to appear. We actually don't, I want to make sure you guys were aware of this, but at the same time we don't tend to work this in too much into our outbreak planning because we found that it just hasn't been particularly relevant, that if we look at the animals at the period that they're at currently, that seems to help us enough with risk assessment that we don't see problems developing further down the line. I can't explain why that's true, but just want to make sure that you're aware of that. And you'll see that as I go through our kind of what we jokingly now call our 12-step program. So the next step is really thinking about planning. We really want to think about, well, what needs to be included in our plan? We know a clean break needs to be included. We know we need an evaluation for clinical signs. We're going to need diagnostics. And then we're going to do this initial risk assessment and and then we'll get our diagnostic results back and we'll shuffle. So we're going to go through all of those steps. But it's important before you kind of run off into the steps that you do the planning, because you really need to think about it and say, well, okay, we need to establish a clean break. Is that something we can do? And what that means is that you need to establish a separate area of the shelter that's clean where unexposed animals will go. And so for some shelters, if you feel like, wow, there's no way we can establish a clean break, then you need to do something to defer new animals coming in so that you're not just adding to your outbreak, because then you can end up with a kind of just spiraling out of control situation. And so we want to do, the other thing is, diagnostics. Do you have a way to do fungal cultures? Do you have someone who can read the fungal cultures? Do you have someone who knows how to use a woods lamp? I see there's a question about using griseofulvin, and we don't use griseofulvin, and it's not even available anymore because it has a very, very narrow therapeutic range for cats, which means it has a very narrow range in which it's not very toxic to cats. It also is not particularly effective against ringworm. It doesn't localize in the skin the same way that the itraconazole does. Okay, so now let's come back. This is where now we've done our planning. We know we have the resources to do what we want to do, or we've mobilized them. And so if we think about Dr. Moriello's idea about the days, we can say, well, this could all have happened in the first day. Or it could be that this is day 3 or day 4. And so we really want to kind of think about, and when you do your planning, maybe even plan out the number of days. What I want to stress is that it doesn't need to be 2 weeks later, that we can really get in there and do all of this stuff in a relatively small period of time. And one of the reasons I wanted to read you the email from the Case 2 shelter that I read to you is they were phenomenal in terms of responding. As soon as they realized, wow, this really is a ringworm outbreak, they got in there and they started working and moving things around and started treating kitties really quickly. So when we think about a clean break, what we really want to do is we want to establish this clean break like a wall, like a firewall, to separate the new incoming cats from the cats that are in the exposed population. Now, at this point, we don't know who in the exposed population is infected and who's not. So we're going to get to that in just a minute. But to start out with, just as a way of stopping the cycle of infection, we put up this red firewall between new incoming cats and the exposed population. This could be just a different room than this room. This could even be part of a room where we understand that this clean break has been set up. I'm a lover of red duct tape, and there's no reason you can't just put some red duct tape on the floor with some signs and train your staff that they need to take care of all the new incoming cats first, or wearing different clothing and different gloves than they would with the exposed population. The idea is just to separate the two populations so that any risk of exposure stops. Next thing we want to do is start evaluating for clinical signs, and this is where we're going to start looking at individual animals and see who has lesions and who doesn't. And this is where it's really handy if you know how to use an Excel sheet. If you don't, you can just make a list on paper, but where you really want to make a list, like you saw before, where you see the animal's identification, either their name or a number, and then you're going to put down whether or not you're seeing lesions and whether or not the animal was Woods positive. And so hopefully you guys can appreciate that we've got some problems going on in this ear and along the ear margin right here. Hopefully everybody would pick that up. This is a lot more subtle and looks a lot like chin acne until you put a Woods lamp on it, and then you see that this is actually a ringworm infection where the hair loss just hasn't quite gotten as obvious as it could. And one of the reasons that I included this is that these are the kind of lesions that I see get missed most often when people aren't using a Woods lamp, because there's sort of an assumption that it's something else. And so don't forget the Woods lamp, because something that doesn't look like a lesion in regular light, like a ringworm lesion in regular light, may make itself really, really obvious as soon as you put the Woods lamp on it. And so here's an example so you guys can see of when we see that kind of blue-white glow. But again, this is not the skin glowing. This is fluorescence that's painted or kind of coated each individual hair, so you can see here and here how there's separate little hairs that are glowing. Okay, so now we've got our clean break set up, we've got our exposed population, and we're going to screen all of them, looking for lesions, looking for Woods lamp positives. But we can't forget that at the same time we need to keep screening our new incoming cats, because we've created this clean break, and the last thing we want to do is have a ringworm infected cat sneak into our clean break area. So as we're screening the new incoming cats, if we do a screening and we find somebody's positive, then they need to move along this way over to the other side of the clean break. And that's a really crucial piece that some shelters forget, and I've definitely seen that kind of turn around and bite people, so we need to be careful with that. We went through this screening protocol in the last session, and I know it looks so complicated when you put it on a slide like this, but I'll walk you through just a little bit just to make sure. So this is exactly the same as what we did in the last webinar, where we start with a screening exam and a culture. Are there lesions? All the animals, lesions or not, need to get a Woods lamp exam. Anybody who's positive is going to be treated as truly infected. We're still going to do a culture. We want to check with a direct exam, because a direct exam of the Woods positive hairs, as I always say, is like a snap test. It really confirms that our Woods exam was what we thought, and we'll treat those as truly infected. If we either get a negative direct exam or a negative Woods exam, but we saw a lesion, then we've got to wait for culture results. And that's the thing I know that you guys were asking about. Everybody wishes there was something faster than waiting for culture results, but there isn't. We can warm up the cultures and have them grow a little more quickly, and that's great. But what's really good is if we're seeing no lesions, no Woods positive, we let those animals move on. I saw there were some questions about, should we dip those kitties? Should we dip kitties as they're coming in? These kitties, you certainly can dip them, and that would remove any spores that may be on their coat, but we need to always balance how much stress that is for the cat with what the actual benefit is. So if it's a kitty that's lesion negative and Woods lamp negative, the likelihood when we're doing our risk assessment is that most kitties are not going to have a problem with ringworm later on. So we usually let those non-lesional kitties move on as we're doing the assessment. The other thing to remember is sometimes, you know, if you have 150 kitties, how many kitties are you going to need to dip? So anybody that you don't need to dip, you probably want to skip over on the dip, because it can be a really exhausting and time-consuming, stressful experience for the staff or volunteers who have to do the dipping. And so we want to kind of think about that. Somebody's asking a question about if ringworm is much more prevalent in cats, and yes, that is definitely true. Session 1 talks about that, and so we're really focusing on cats here, but please know that almost everything we're saying here about cats is equally true for dogs. The thing that's really important to remember with dogs is there's lots of other things that cause lesions that look like ringworm in dogs. So again, I wanted to just kind of remind you guys about doing the direct exam as part of your screening, because if you see something like this, you know that's positive and you can move that animal to treatment as quickly as possible. After we do the screening, this is kind of step 5, this is where we start to shuffle. So our first shuffle was kind of creating the clean break and moving all our exposed population into one place, and we often will sometimes call that the clean area and the dirty area. Now we're going to shuffle our dirty area. So we did this initial risk assessment. It was based on the results of all of the screening that we did. We're going to remove all the animals that we identified as positive from the general population. In an ideal world, they're all going to go to treatment. We're going to isolate and separate suspect animals. So this is the part that's not as clean as what we'd love it to be, where, you know, we wish we had an immediate answer for these animals, but these are the animals where we need to wait and find out what's going on. But the non-lesional wood-negative cats are going to go on their way. As I said, we can either do a dip and go, or if you feel like you're concerned because if it's a shelter where you're seeing lesions in almost every cat in the whole shelter, then you may want to even follow up and do culture results on everyone. For step 6, now we're going to start evaluating the risk. How high is the risk? As I said, how many animals are infected? How hot does the infection seem to be? How bad are the lesions? What are the intake practices? Is it open intake? What are the sanitation practices? Are animals being mixed together in housing units? Is most of the housing in the shelter group housing? What's the level of disease and what age is affected? We're not going to use anything like stray or surrender because that doesn't really tell us very much about what the risk is. The next thing we want to do is sample the environment, and I did get a bunch of questions after the last session about, well, can we use the woods lamp on the environment? Will that show contamination in the environment? And sadly, it will not, because the spores only create that fluorescent metabolite when they're growing, and they coat the hair with that. So we can't use that to find spores in the environment, but what we can use is Swiffers. And I have to tell you that Karen Moriello and I both have tried approaching the company that makes Swiffers to see if we could interest them in, some kind of special pricing or something for shelters. And what they've told us several times is that Swiffers are not a veterinary product. But we feel that they are. And so they're a great way of culturing the environment. And what we tend to do is be in a place that we're pretty sure is spore-free, and we cut them into quarters, and we take those little quarters and put them in Ziploc bags, and then you take them into the area that you want to sample, and you use a Swiffer and wipe an area where hair might collect. And then you use those Swiffers and inoculate culture plates just like you would with a toothbrush if you were culturing a cat. So, and then you can evaluate those with pathogen scores just like you can a cat. And what's really nice about it is it helps you target where the infection, or not where the contamination, is. So if I'm in my living room and I want to know, well, did I get ringworm all over the sofa, I can actually take a sample from my sofa, and then I'll know. And then I can go back and try to clean in that area, and I can sample again and see if I got rid of it. So step 8, now we start to get our culture results back. And now if we're thinking about Dr. Moriello's day system, this is going to be, this one is around day 4 or day 5. We're already seeing really strong suspect growth on this plate. We see the media turning red. We see this kind of clear to white finger-like growth within this culture plate, and this has me on edge now because this looks to me like it's going to be positive. So this is how we would now identify this animal as suspect. This is what it looks like once we have our final result. And this is now an identifiable culture. So here's about, this one is about day 4, and this is probably day 7. But we're still at step 8. Here's what we see, just because I'm beating you over the head with it. This is our microscopic identification of the culture plate. We went into more depth on this in the first webinar. Here's our response based on our pathogen score. So now we're going to take the kitties that we had positive culture results on, and we're going to kind of sort through them again. And what we're going to say is if it's 1 to 9 colony-forming units that grew on the plate, then we're going to say that we're going to use this system. And basically, if it was only 1 to 9 and there were no lesions present, we're going to say that was a dust mop. So that was a cat who was just carrying spores on their coat, but we're not going to be really dramatically worried about them. We're either going to just let them go on their way, or we're going to give them what we call a dip and go, which is a single topical treatment. If they have lesions and a positive culture, which is what we're seeing along this pathway, then we treat that as true infection. The same as if they had 10 or more colony-forming units, we're going to treat that as true infection, and you can see both of those would end up being high risk. So if you have lesions and a positive culture, then you would say yes, that those are animals we're going to treat as truly infected. Our culture results, when I'm talking about getting culture results back, we also get culture results back from rooms. So I just wanted to remind you of that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to shuffle the animals again based on their culture results, and then we're going to go and attack the environment and get that really clean. Jennifer's got a question about determining pathogen score, and that's just based on the number of colony-forming units. So 1 to 9 is a P1 or P2, and over 9 is a P3. I mean, we go into that in the first webinar, too. So now we're going to shuffle again, basically. Now we know, now the ones that we thought were suspect and everybody who was in limbo, we should have an answer on. So we're going to remove the positives from the general population, and this is where we go back and we clean like heck. So we clean everything, and hopefully we had a way that we could target the environment. This is my devil kitty, my foster kitty who fell in the bathtub, and I tried to take a picture of her, and this is what I got, and I thought it was great because she looks completely possessed. But so can you safely send them somewhere else? So if what we're saying is we want to separate these kitties from the general population, where should we put them? And ideally, they would go into a treatment area at the shelter where we can control the spread of this disease. We really need to be careful because this is a human pathogen. But if we're going to send them somewhere else, these are the things that we really need to think about. We really want to use effective treatment. So we don't want to just send them somewhere else and wait 3 weeks and hope it's going to go away. We want to use effective treatments. We want to include a topical treatment because the topical treatments really dramatically knock down the spread of spores into the environment, because the topical treatment is sporicidal, so it kills all the spores that are on the animal's coat. And so if we do that before we send them somewhere else, that's the safest way of doing it. We want to keep them away from other pets, children, or immune-compromised humans whenever possible. And we want to put them in an easily disinfected area. And we want to pick resilient and compliant humans. So we want to make sure they're people that are going to actually do what you're asking them to do so that they don't end up spreading ringworm all over their house. And yes, the lime dip is topical treatment. So sorry, when I'm saying topical treatment, what I usually mean is lime sulfur dip. I know we have some people here who aren't from the United States, and in some places it's really hard for them to get the lime dip, or they can't use it because it's considered an agriculture product. So that's why I'm using topical treatment instead of always calling it lime sulfur. We definitely don't want to send ringworm-positive animals to uninformed adopters. Ideally, if we can, we want to get them in an in-shelter isolation area. This is one that we set up in Wisconsin, and I just wanted you guys to see because it is so not fancy, but it worked so well, and hundreds of animals went through this facility and got treated. You can see how I put my red duct tape down here, and we created a dirty area, and then there was a clean area on the outside of it. There were 9 cages here, 6 in the back for cats who had ringworm and upper respiratory disease. and it worked great. So don't think that just because you don't have, you know, like state-of-the-art treatment area, you can set up a ringworm treatment area in your shelter as long as you're careful and systematic about the way you do it. Step 10 is to really create a long-term response plan. So you just went through all that work to get rid of ringworm. You want to make sure that it doesn't sneak in on you again. So you want to do everything you can to eliminate the risk factors. And you'll see, I know I'm a little bit of a broken record about screening on intake, but it's the most important thing you can do to make sure it doesn't sneak in. We want to do the visual exam combined with a woods lamp exam. I got an email today from somebody asking me about using a woods lamp and do they really need to let it warm up for 5 to 10 minutes. And the answer I always really want to give is just leave it on all day. Because if it's sitting there all day, you don't have to worry about it warming up and you'll always use it. And the truth is, even in one shelter that was having a really hard time getting compliance from their staff to use the woods lamp on every animal coming in, when I went in to assess it, what I realized was that the outlet was all the way on the other side of the room, and so for them to use the woods lamp was a giant pain in the neck. And so we actually ended up dropping a new outlet right by the exam table that they use for intake, and all of a sudden everybody was using it because it wasn't as complicated and hard for them to do. So always screen on intake. Screening before rehousing is a really key thing to do, because just in case some animals develop new lesions, you know, before you send them out to your off-site adoption center that's in the middle of a pet store, before you send them out, you know, anywhere that you're going to rehouse, before you put them into group housing section, just check them over for lesions and look with a woods exam. Even if you're not going to culture them, that in itself is going to get you 90% of the way there, maybe even 100% of the way there. Look at kittens and put in special precautions to protect them. Isolate or separate suspect or affected cats. Always treat with effective topicals. Monitor, 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 monitor. Like, always be watching. Teach your staff to monitor. One of the most interesting things, I think, and we'll talk about this in the last webinar, is one of the most interesting things that we found in the field study where we really implemented a ringworm treatment protocol in a shelter in Wisconsin at the Dane County Humane Society. The big difference that we saw is that when there was an option that animals might be treated rather than just euthanized, all of a sudden everyone under the sun was reporting ringworm lesions to us. Whereas before, if somebody noticed a ringworm lesion, they probably never said anything about it because they didn't want to be the one to point out the thing that might cause that animal to be euthanized. And after we had this treatment program in place, we'd have, you know, happy volunteers coming up to me in the hallways pointing out it was almost like they were glad that the kitten had ringworm because they knew it was going to get to go to the area where they got so much great attention and everything else. So what we found was that having treatment as at least an option really increased compliance with reporting. And that was something that we had never really thought about and was such a happy surprise to us. Again, when you're treating, I hope you'll use lime sulfur and itraconazole because we just feel so confident with it. We see animals get better so quickly. We've never seen a treatment failure. And even in the studies that we do where we're trying out different treatments, we always use lime sulfur and itraconazole as what we call our rescue treatment. So if the one that we're testing out isn't working as well as we like, and if it's not got cure by 6 weeks, then we always go to lime sulfur and itraconazole, and we always see it work. I see some people, Amanda is talking about ketoconazole, and ketoconazole is not nearly as effective as itraconazole for ringworm. Ketoconazole isn't really indicated for ringworm. So we want to be really careful with the treatments that you're using and make sure you're talking with a veterinarian and finding medications that are directly targeting for the pathogens you're trying to treat. With this protocol using lime sulfur and itraconazole, we define cure as 2 consecutive negative cultures taken at 1-week intervals. And so I wanted to be clear that that's only with lime sulfur and itraconazole, and that's only because of the hundreds of cats that we put through that treatment protocol. And what we found is that when an animal got to that point, they never looked back. So once we got to the point where they had 2 negative cultures 2 weeks apart, that they never turned around and became positive again. So we were really happy with that. And so here's just an example of what that looks like and how you could see that. One thing I wanted to make sure everybody's aware of is that hair loss may not be resolved by, excuse me, hair loss may not be resolved by the time you've actually achieved cure. So a lot of the time the fungus goes away faster than the hair comes back. And that's why we want to use fungal cultures to define the cure. Because if we wait for the hair to grow back, a lot of the time, like, the animal's just been sitting there waiting when really they were cured all along. On the other hand, one of the ways I've come to recognize an ineffective treatment is when the animal remains fungal culture positive, even though their hair is starting to grow back in some places. And that what's happening is the animal is self-curing in some places, but not in others. But the treatment itself is not particularly effective. So I'm going to grab one other thing from the chat because I see somebody is talking about getting formulated itraconazole, and I'm not in particularly knocking Roadrunner Pharmacy, but we did talk about that a little bit in the last webinar, so I hope you'll go back and see that what we have found is that formulated itraconazole for some reason is just not nearly as effective as the brand name product that's not formulated, and it may have something to do with the bioavailability of it. But so in general, we don't recommend using a formulated product. Okay, very last thing that I wanted to talk about is the idea of an intake quarantine. We really don't recommend it, and instead we use excellent monitoring as the alternative. If you were going to do intake quarantine, you would need to do it for that 2 to 3 week long period. It would jam up all your population flow through, and what we have seen is that it's, as I said, clinically, if we take a picture of the animal at the point of intake or at the point that we're evaluating them during an outbreak, clinically what we found is that's really enough. So we don't recommend that intake quarantine. So in summary, just to kind of sum up all of that, it's a lot of information, and I know there were a lot of questions still outstanding, and that's why we scheduled that extra 90 minutes where all we're going to do is just answer your questions. So please, I hope you guys will come to that and send us your questions. Exam screening is such an incredibly powerful tool. It is cheap. It's fun. I know it sounds silly, but cats really generally do like it, getting scrubbed all over with a toothbrush. It's easy to do. Outbreak response can be devastating and unbelievably costly. You can do it. I don't want you to, I don't by any means want to say it's something that you can't do, but beating it before it happens is the way to go. And so lives can be saved if you use a systematic approach to beating an outbreak, but what we really want is to have you avoid those outbreaks in the first place. I want to thank you guys for all your caring and for all your attention. It's so great to see such an active chat happening. I want to thank the ASPCA for the partnership with UC Davis that makes my position possible. And I tend to close with Ken almost every one of these webinars because he was our first customer through our ringworm treatment program at the Dane County Humane Society, and he's incredibly cute. So thanks to you guys.
Thanks so much, Sandra, and thanks, everybody. And remember, we are adding a new 90-minute Q&A session. Let's talk fungus. Why the heck not? So sign up and bring all your questions. We're going to get to all of them. Thanks, everybody. Hope to see you next time.
Bye, everybody. Have a great day.